What's up, guys? How are we doing today? I haven't made an episode in 3 days. Been trying to thin out my content a little bit, allow people to catch up. I'm just putting too much stuff out there for people to have the time to stay in touch with what I'm doing. So I figured the best thing was just to kind of thin it out a little bit, allow people to do some catching up viewing when they got the time. Pulling my hair out a little bit here because still unemployed, still sitting at home. I'm so used to the process of making episodes that now I got these 4, 5, 6 hours a day where I'm just like, guess I'll just listen to records, which has been good. We're going to dig into 1960 next week. Started to compile my list. Again, a fantastic year in jazz. Those of you who have enjoyed the Record Store Day 53 through 59, it's been interesting watching the chronology. Definitely jazz is really going through some stretching out and growing pains at this point. And it's interesting to see where a lot of the innovation is coming from. It's not the standard places that we often would think it would be. And I think it's very clear how Miles Davis throughout this period isn't one of the great innovators. He's kind of tagging along, bringing what's innovative to the masses, but he's certainly not the innovator. He's kind of the guy who's just going, okay, yeah, that's what's happening in jazz. Let me bring that to the table for everyone. And of course, Kind of Blue was a landmark recording, as was his, stuff on Columbia in 57, 58. But he's not this guy out ahead of the pack leading, as the modern day collector would often have us believe. The modern day critic and reviewer even. I think too many people are given the authority to write reviews and to talk about the history of jazz, and they're just repeating things that have already been said. Repeating what's already written by the last critic. It's not much of a critique if you're just looking up what the last few critics said and regurgitating it. There truly needs to be the scope of the entire era, what's happening across the country, on both sides of the racial fence, what region is leading the pack. There's a lot of things you need to factor into seeing where things are happening. And to see it chronologically developing, it really makes it clear how really the West Coast was doing some great things in 53, 54, 55, 56. It was pretty hard driving. It's far from the cool that the conception seems to be of the West Coast sound. There was cool out there, but a lot of what was happening was definitely not just cool. But today I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to call this One Famous, One Unknown. I'm just going to review 2 records, one that everybody should know, and hopefully will lure some viewers in. And then I'm going to do one that is going to be far less popular. And hopefully that'll be for the people who are more hardcore, who want to dig a little deeper. I'm trying to find my way here to keep it fresh content and new, and keep it so that people want to tune in. Anyway, let's dig in. First record we're going to talk about today, from 1957, one of the great Blue Notes of all time, one of the great jazz records of all time, one of Coltrane's greatest records of all time, of course, Blue Train. It's Blue Note number 1577, which, if you saw my episode on 1957, and then my 2-part series on Blue Note in 1957, Blue Note's doing some incredible things in this moment. It's a focused, label-wide attack on the senses, and it really defines what hard bop sounds and looks like. Sonny Clark's a huge part of that. Coltrane's on a number of his records. There's a whole lot of shaking and moving going on at Blue Note right now. And this record, of course, is one of the hallmarks of the Blue Note label. 2 very important factors on this record are Kenny Drew, one of the great piano players who had worked early on with Miles' group, with Coltrane, with Chambers, and with Philly Joe. But Miles abandoned them out west, as my friend Jean-Michel told me, and Kenny Drew ended up punching Miles in the face, which I think a lot of people wish they had done. They're out west. Miles is up and leaves them there in the hotel, jobless, penniless, ticketless, and they end up making a record called Chambers West for a small little label to make money to get home. and Kenny Drew punches Miles when he gets back to town. So Kenny Drew was the original pianist in Miles' group for a moment, and then Red Garland, of course, fills that shoes, and then he's dismissed kind of unceremoniously, and then when Kelly steps in, and then he's dismissed to let Bill Evans in. Then he gets back in the group, and Miles would be an awful person to work for, just awful. His insecurities drove him so incredibly. But Kenny Drew is a really important part of this record, and he brings a lot of vivacious flashes of life and light from the keyboard. He really has this deft touch that really seems to fit the spirit of hard bop really wonderfully. In some ways, I think he's been hearing what Sonny Clark's doing. That percussive tact, that just aggression from the piano. Not something you often hear. Chambers is at one of his best places in his career here. Of course, Chambers' career is pretty incredible. The amount of work that Paul Chambers does. Someone as a leader, but mostly as a sideman. He's on hundreds of records. A lot of the Hall of Fame records of the 50s and 60s, Paul Chambers is, of course, a part of, as is Philly Joe Jones. But again, the other real important part of this session is 1957, Lee Morgan and Curtis Fuller are both fairly unknown commodities. They're both starting to appear on the scene. Lee Morgan's got a thing or two at Savoy. He's starting to work with Hank Mobley. Morgan's starting to become a figure on the Blue Note scene, but he certainly wasn't a giant yet. And Curtis Fuller, even more so, was kind of a new cat, arrived on the scene in 56, maybe early 57. He has a few records already at Blue Note at this time. And so they're recruiting this incredible group. Young, hungry kids, the experience and talent of Kenny Drew, Paul Chambers standing giant over that bass, Philly Joe laying down the thunder that he does so well, and it's a delicate thunder, you know. And then of course Coltrane is in the middle of working with Monk at this point, so Monk is impacting Coltrane. Coltrane seeing new potential possibilities for how this music can be done. So not only is hard bop exploding with this raw, emotive, emotionally driven context, Monk is informing John on the elements of edge and the potential nature of angles and blocks and dissonance. And I think his impact on Coltrane, and most critics agree, is pretty immense. And so all those factors come together to make one of the landmark recordings of Alfred Lyon's Blue Note label. Their album starts off with the title track Blue Train, which is a fantastic opening refrain. The trombone sounds just wonderful of Curtis Fuller. Morgan and Coltrane are full of fire. The second track right here is Moment's Notice. And again, it's a fairly up-tempo, bright colors. There's that prototypical John sound right there. And I love when he comes in here. He just brings some real fire and ferocity. And the tempo. You know, Philly Jones and Paul Chambers and Kenny Drew are putting those hammers down. And so the record has a real adrenaline, high-octane fuel to it that is part of what makes it one of the great records of all time. Playing at tempo, contrary to belief, is not easy to do. The two hardest things in music is playing in time, slow, and then playing clean, fast. Enunciating your notes, making clean melodic phrases, like Clifford Brown showed us how it could be done. But playing fast, a lot of guys will start jamming notes in and duplicating notes, and they ignore melodic structuring, they ignore harmonic structuring, they're just throwing notes out there. And people I've read it said that you can take Charlie Parker and slow him down and still hear these melodic, beautiful lines that are lyrical and still are telling a narration of a story, and they never sacrifice that human communicative skill set. And that to me is the drawing line defining jazz I love and jazz I'm not so crazy about. It needs to have a human communicative essence to it when it's speaking to me. When the horn player is talking, is he telling me something from his soul? is does it feel like the cadence of a narration? Or does it just feel like cacophony? Which John, of course, delves into in the mid 60s extensively. And of course, from Coltrane's center, it comes off very much as a prayer and an intercession for the people of this planet, for all of us. There's Greg Curtis Fuller. Fuller is one of the great bebop, hard bop trombone players. He's not quite as dexterous as a Jimmy Cleveland or as fluent as a J.J. Johnson, but he's still got a lot of agitation. And that agitation for me lifts him up to the level of the other two, because he plays with such a fuel, with such a intensity. He does have a nice tone. It's thick. It's got that real baritone. He loves to play in that lower register quite a lot. He's, again, a very dexterous player on the trombone, which is a tough thing to slide up and down on tempo. A fantastic record. We're going to flip it over here to Locomotion, which is one of my favorite tracks ever. And I'm not going to delve into this too deeply, but the tempo here is, again, fantastic. But I've spoken on this before several times. The Locomotion for me was an eye-opening track. It was a record, I've heard this record 1,000 times. And I was listening to it one day, and Coltrane plays his long verse, doing his solo. Fuller does his great solo, and they're both expressing nicely. And again, I heard this record a lot. And then there's Fuller. And I was listening to it one day kind of somewhat casually, and I created the term throat grabber a few months back. And probably the first time I really had a throat grabbing experience was when Lee Morgan comes in here. And it shook my core. And it kind of was a realization to me that expression via emoting is the essence of what jazz is about. And I can kind of tell you how I feel today based on the timbre, the tempo, the tonality, the phrasing, the aggression. All those things are going to tell you something about how I'm feeling right now. And a guy that's feeling melancholy and blue is going to express differently than a guy who's fucking pissed off. Or a guy who's feeling romantic, or a guy who's hungry. There's different contexts to every emotional landscape, and that horn player especially has this extension of himself that's allowed me to tap into, if I'm sensitive to hear it, his mindset. That's the essence of jazz. It's not about the notes and the virtuosity. It's about, what is this guy telling me? What's he expressing? And Locomotion for me, Curtis, when Lee Morgan comes in, I was like, God, he sounds pissed off today. Someone must have splashed him with a bus, big puddle on his way to the studio. And I'm like, oh shit, that's what jazz is about. Jazz is me telling you how I feel right now in this moment, unfettered by the bondage of lyrics. Lyrics requires me to say the same thing every time I do a song. Me just telling my soul how I feel through my horn, I can make that in the moment every time I do it. And no two times will be the same, because I never feel exactly the same twice. And that's the essence of jazz. That's the magic of jazz. That live in real-time connection with how a cat feels in the world and how he's telling you about his experience within the world. And again, that's just what, it changed how I heard everything. I had to go back and rehear everything. Instead of being a musician with a pen in my mouth critiquing, oh yes, he's playing the flatted fifth and it's a wonderful diatonic scale and he's really manipulating it wasn't about the technique anymore or the mathematics of the music. It was about the raw emotional connection, and all the other shit was mumbo jumbo and a byproduct of what I had to say. This is how I feel. If you want to break down the science behind it, go ahead. But it ain't what it's about. It's about me telling you, God damn it, today I'm fucking frustrated. And so that for me made me have to go read back and listen to every jazz record I've ever owned over again over the last 10 years. And it's a lot of us led me to have this channel because it's how I've heard jazz so differently now. And a lot of you have probably heard this before from me, but those of you who are new who haven't heard it, listen to your jazz records from that context. what is the emotional setup of the guy who's playing right now? Where's he coming from? And sometimes it's not so evident. Sometimes it's not so clear. But every time someone grabs my throat, I'm feeling a guy's soul emote something and tell me something. Oh, okay. That's coming from somewhere. Something raw fueled that. And then you take their experience and their environment and their personality, and you can start to paint what that guy's telling you. The next track on this record is a lovely ballad. It's the only ballad on the record. It's the only song that Coltrane didn't write, actually. I'm old-fashioned. And it's a beautiful lyrical ballad. And it reminds you of just how much Dexter Gordon, Coleman Hawkins, even Ben Webster, John Coltrane can channel when he wants to, when he's feeling that. And on his impulse stuff, a lot of those records are devoid of ballads, or they're more mid-tempo. They don't really quite get into the straightforward ballad that you hear on a lot of the Prestige stuff and you'll hear here on Blue Note. And I like Coltrane as a ballad player. It's nice hearing his ideations slow down to a pulse that I can ingest. When he's playing fast at tempo, doing those sheets of sound things on the Prestige records, it's just like you're being lambasted with sound. You're like, I can't decipher it. You know, when he plays at mid-tempo or slow tempo, it's a lot easier to kind of get into his emotional context. The record rounds itself out with the wonderful Lazy Bird, which people say is kind of a take on Lady Bird by Tad Dameron. It's truly jazz royalty, this record. It changed my jazz listening experience completely. Completely rewrote how I heard jazz. I set aside all the numerical mumbo jumbo, all the virtuosity for the sake of virtuosity, and started to recognize it was the soul of a man speaking through his instrument, which is what great art always does. And then when you factor in that layer of history of the black experience in America, I'm guessing most of these cats have a lot on their mind. A lot of things they want to get off their chest. And that's where the euphoric connection to the music happens for me, where my hair stands on end on my arm and I'm like, wow, this is the passive resistance of great art saying my place in this world matters and you're going to hear what I have to say. I'm going to leave a legacy behind. After I'm gone, my name will ring through the hills, not for the words I spoke, but for the honesty of what my soul had to say. And that's where the power in these records comes from. And that's what hard bop has to have. You know, bebop is more driven by ego and more driven by virtuosity. And that's not to say Parker doesn't have a ton of soul. He does. But there's a lot of bebop that feels just like notes coming at you. Hard bop is very emotive in its nature. And for my definition, it's not something White Cats can play. I've never heard White Cats play hard bop. I've heard them play things that sound fairly close. And some of those West Coast records, where they're playing pretty up-tempo stuff, is certainly near to hard bop. But for me, there's that emotional context of unified black men speaking on their experience that makes hard bop what it is. And Lazy Bird is the last track on this record. So again, Fuller, Morgan, Coltrane, Philly Joe, Paul Chambers, and Kenny Drew. One of the great records of all time. We're going to move on to the second part of this episode, and that's a record that's much less well known. And there's a Coltrane connection here as well. Elvin Jones is the drummer here, and this is his session. This is before he left the Coltrane Quartet. He's already starting to do some side work at Impulse. And I think it's fairly informative because you can hear what he's doing outside of the Coltrane group at this point. And it's a fairly big departure from where Coltrane is sonically. The quartet's been propelled out to the edges of the cosmos by Coltrane, the addition of Pharoah Sanders. It's just getting fairly extreme. noise-driven. And McCoy and Elvin especially just felt like they wanted to come back to the center some. And he makes this record, Dear John Coltrane, in 1965, I believe. Dear John C. It's Impulse number 88. It's a beautiful old mono pressing. It's got Hank Jones on piano on most of it, who is Elvin's brother, older brother. And Hank's one of the great unheralded piano players of this music. He's on so many great sessions. He lives to be quite an old, brilliant piano player in his older age. He's still making really impressive records. He ends up winning a lot of Lifetime Achievement Awards as an old fella because his contributions were just so incredible. Roland Hanna plays piano on a couple tracks on this as well. For the most of the record, Richard Davis is on the bass. And then Charlie Mariano is given the responsibility of channeling Coltrane to some degree. And Charlie Mariano, for me, is one of the greatest white saxophone players that ever exists. There's young Charlie Mariano right there. He's an Italian-American. That's Richard Davis. There's Hank Jones, Bob Thiele in the background. And there's, of course, Elvin Jones, whose t-shirt I am wearing right now, again with the cigarette in his mouth. These guys like to smoke back in the day. I guess everybody did. But Smoke Rings is great. Dear John C is great. Feeling Good is fantastic. Phantasm's fantastic. They're doing some wonderful odes to what the early Coltrane quartet was about. There's some modality, there's some avant-garde edges, there's some great tempos, but it's more melodic centered like earlier Coltrane was, 62, 63. Elvin, I feel like, was probably even more so than McCoy, ready to really move back to the blues. He's a Detroit raised cat. He comes up in the strong sense of the blues from the Swing Cats, all the great cats he hung out with in Detroit as a kid. His two brothers, Thad and Hank, are institutions in the music, and he's been taken on this epic journey with John Coltrane, but I think he was ready to get off that train at this point. And at the same time, though, he's paying homage to his great friend. You know, he's about to leave the quartet here. By the end of '65, he steps out. And this is recorded in February of '65, so he's definitely still in the group. And if you've seen my episode on 1965 in regards to John Coltrane's career, there's like 15, 18 records out today that document that group in 1965. It's an incredible body of work that the Coltrane Quartet's doing in '65. From stuff that came out at the time, to stuff that's been issued later, to alternate versions of stuff, live recordings. It's just an incredible amount of material from 1965. By the end of '65, Pharoah Saunders has been dabbling with the group on Ascension and Kula San Mama. He ends up joining the group and becoming a full-time member. Rashid Ali becomes the second drummer, and eventually by the end of the year, McCoy and Elvin both leave. And Coltrane kind of finishes off his next couple years in a different direction with his wife Alice, Rashid Ali, and they go in their own way. And you start hearing Elvin Jones showing up on Grant Green records. And Charlie Mariano here is just wonderful. It's just beautiful. And if you're not familiar with Charlie Mariano, he's a West Coast cat, came up in the Stan Kenton, Woody Herman groups. He starts doing stuff as a side guy at Capitol Records. He's working with the West Coast cats like Shelly Manne and Howard Rumsey, a lot of those great West Coast contemporary Pacific groups. Mariano's showing up on those sessions. And then when Bethlehem opens up their West Coast office, he's one of the first guys they hire to start doing records of their own as a leader. And his 3 records as a leader for Bethlehem are outstanding. And I've said it many times. So it's fun to hear Mariano in this context. Of course, he's also playing with Mingus at this point as well. So Charlie Mariano has a really great legacy, and he's one of the white sax players that the brothers absolutely gave full credence to. And musicians are musicians. They always understand each other, and they know when you're real, when you're not. They know when you're bringing it and you're not. And as my saxophone series illustrates, a lot of these white cats, jazz was a stepping stone to other places in their career. It was something that when they were 18, 20, 30, 25, it felt essential and necessary, and I'm sure they did it with full intention of and full love of the music, but they never stayed. Most of them moved on to other things. And economics kind of dictated that. So they ended up in Hollywood studio orchestras, playing for TV studios, playing in Vegas lounges. The white cats all moved on to a lot of different things in music. The black cats died, played jazz their whole life, or became high school teachers. That was pretty much the extent of it. Buddy Collette was like the one exception. But Mariano's in the game for a long time. He lives into the 80s or 90s, maybe even 2000s. He's around a long time, Mariano. And his early work at Bethlehem, his side work at Impulse, he's truly an unheralded great. And so that's my unknown record. And a lot of collectors are going to know this because it's on Impulse. And labels do help dictate and shape the legacy of records. A record on Blue Note or Impulse is going to get discovered by a lot more people than one on some small label that no one's heard of. You can put a great record on Jubilee, and it'll sell for $15 because no one knows what Jubilee is. You put a great record on Impulse, this record goes for 60, 80, $100 all day nowadays. I've probably seen it for up to like 200. If you can see this for under $40, you should buy it. It's great, especially for the old mono copies. Fantastic, fantastic stuff. Fantastic, beautiful artwork. That beautiful Impulse look to it. So, this is something I've been thinking about doing for a while. Doing more in-depth album reviews. We've talked a lot about labels. We've talked about musicians and artists, instruments, and the last kind of real domain was to start delving into albums specifically themselves. I think the best way to do it is to do one famous record and one not so famous record. Let me know what you think of that. We're going to start doing the 1960 episode coming up in a day or two. I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. Again, it's an incredible period in time in jazz. My name is Dan. I am the Jazz Shepherd. I appreciate all you guys who've been with me this last year, watching the channel grow. My Patreon page has been a nice addition. It's putting a few $100 in my pocket every month, which is needed right now. So blessings to all of you who have blessed me. We're all in my thoughts and my prayers. The cosmos is watching us. Let's all do the right thing, guys. Let's keep loving our hearts, our eyes and ears open. Let's not believe what we hear, what we see. Let's believe what we feel. And let's treat the news that we hear every day the same way we treat jazz. Believe what you feel. If it don't feel right, it probably ain't. Don't matter what you see, they can fool you. Don't matter what you hear, they can lie. Believe what you feel. And if it feels right, it probably is. If it feels wrong, chances are. Because our soul is smarter than our mind. Our mind is fooled by our senses all the time. I can't trust what I see. I've seen all kind of things happen that it looked like that building was demolished to me, but you say a plane hit it, okay. There's the plane. Eyes can lie. Words can lie. What you hear can lie. What you feel, that's all I can trust. I'm 48, and even my kids speak to me. I gotta rely on what I feel, not what you say, not what you're telling me, not what you're showing me. It doesn't feel like it's coming from a place that's real. And it's not hard with kids, man. They're so transparent. I'm probably the best parent and the worst parent at times, you know. I love my kids dearly. My stepkids are great boys. But I got a pretty good bullshit alarm. You know, I probably could have been a detective. And I don't like it when you change your story, son. Start changing your story on me. I got to start wondering. And that's part of the problem with the current news narrative, is there's so much story changing going on. It makes it hard to quantify what's really going on. So anyway, who knows? Y'all be blessed. Y'all be safe. I'll talk to you soon. Let me know what you thought of this episode. Any thoughts, feedback, ideas, let me know. They'll be safe. Peace.